Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our 6th forum in the AICCM Preventive Special Interest Group Series, Agents of Change, 10 agents over 10 months. I would first like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of country. I'm here on Turrbal and Yagara country tonight, but we have people joining us from many places. We acknowledge their connections to the land, sea and community and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. We extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. For those I haven't met before, I'm Rhiannon Walker. I work as a conservator for the Collection Online project at the Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art. I'm a member of the committee helping organise this series with Elizabeth Thompson and Tegan Anthys, the convener of the AICCM Preventive SIG. This webinar on pollutants is the 6th in a series of 10 that our special interest group have helped organise. Tonight we have 370 people or more listening from all parts of Australia and across the world. Before we move on to our presentation, there are just a few housekeeping points to remember. The chat on the side of the screen is for comments, while the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen is for specific questions for the speakers. Please turn this on so you can see the questions and feel free to ask these throughout the presentations. You can then upvote using the thumbs up symbol and our moderator will look through these questions to ensure they get to the presenters. The session will be recorded and available in the future on the AICCM website. Now for tonight's presentation on pollutants. I'm very honoured to introduce Jean Tétrault. Jean is a Senior Conservation Scientist at the Canadian Conservation Institute and joins us very early this morning from Canada. I'd also like to introduce David Thickett, who is a Senior Conservation Scientist at English Heritage, and David joins us from the UK this morning. And our first speaker this morning is Lisa Addison, Preventive Conservator at the National Gallery of Australia, joining us from Canberra. Following their presentation, we'll have a Q&A session moderated by Rosemary Goodall. Rosemary is a materials scientist at Museums Victoria and is involved in the identification of materials, particularly hazardous materials. I'm now going to hand you over to Lisa, who will be discussing the polluting effects of the 2019 bushfires on the National Gallery. Thank you, Lisa.
Hi, everyone. Hi, my name is Lisa. I'm from the National Gallery of Australia, and I'm going to talk to you today about the bushfires in Canberra and what we did to mitigate the effects. Just sharing my screen. Okay, and I'm going to turn my camera off. Okay, sorry. Okay, so thanks so much for joining us for the webinar. I'll be sharing what we did to mitigate the effects of the bushfire smoke inside the National Gallery during the summer of 2009 and 2020. This is when the Canberra bushfires were getting a lot of smoke around them, and Canberra had the worst air quality in the world. The majority of this incident was actually managed by the NGA Business Continuity and Collection Disaster Recovery teams, primarily Debbie Ward at the head of conservation and Mark Mandy, the building services manager. And much of this talk's based on their reports. I was actually away at the coast for a lot of it. It's wonderful to be presenting here as the support act to the main rock stars tonight, Jean and David, because I'm a big fan. I refer to their work all the time, and I'm really looking forward to hearing their talks soon. So thanks for being here and your attention before the main acts. Oh, sorry, I'm just trying to go to the next slide. So tonight I'll describe the bushfire smoke risks we faced, the immediate actions taken to protect works of art as best we could during that time, and I'll basically mention the ongoing work following up work we did, and all through it a coordinated response. By sharing our experience, not necessarily a textbook one, I'm not sure if there is one for smoke risk. I hope it'll provide you with some ideas of how works of art can be managed during a smoke incident and resources that can help, ways you can prepare, and perhaps how we can improve our response for the future. This is an image of Canberra at some stage during the fires. Before I go too much further, I did want to acknowledge that today I'm talking to you from Canberra on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and I pay my respects to the traditional custodians of this area for having me here. And I do consider it a privilege to work at the National Gallery and be able to learn from artists and community members and help preserve Indigenous cultural heritage for the future. This is an image of Ngunnawal elder Paul House doing a smoking ceremony during a graduation ceremony from an Indigenous leadership program we had. So yeah, we do have some smoke experience already in the gallery, but this was done outside and downwind of the air intakes. Also, since today I'm talking about bushfire smoke, it's relevant to mention that last year, the wider Australian society is learning more about management of country and bushfire management from the traditional knowledge and wisdom of Indigenous bushfire control. So it's being studied more and integrated into bushfire prevention. So climate change aside, we can only hope that this will avoid some more devastating fires in the future. Okay, so now I just thought it'd be good to do a quick recap about why smoke particulates and why we are concerned about them as agents of deterioration. So number one, smoke particulates are a major health hazard, and I guess a little bit of short-term smoke from a smoking ceremony is just not the end of the world, but they've long been considered a factor in damage to works of art through visual interference and various mechanical and chemical interactions with materials. So yeah, as you can see in this beautiful image, particles come in many sizes and they can be made up of hundreds of different chemicals. Some particles are generated naturally from volcanic eruptions and dust storms, bushfires, but mostly urbanized areas, particles form in the atmosphere through complex reactions of solid and gas phase pollutants like nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxide emitted from combustion, including coal-fired power plants, motor vehicles, particularly diesel, wood fuel heaters, and industry. The particles from smoke and fuel combustion are often described as soot, carbonation deposit, oh, sorry, I haven't changed the slide. Sorry about that. Soot, smoke particles. However, I understand there are a lot of crossover in this terminology. Indoor generation of particulates can include from cooking, candle burning, printing, gas heating, and cleaning, chemical use, life in general, such as shedding skin cells. Okay, so yeah, coarse particles, you can see from the drawing, the diagram, that coarse particles can start up around 90 microns, but even 100 microns or more, right down to fine and ultrafine particles of around 1.1 micron or less. 2.5 microns is considered the standard for fine particles. It's the midpoint of fine particles, and it's used widely. So for the air quality indexes and things like that. Some researchers and authors also refine the classification further for ultrafine particles, meaning that they're less than 0.1 micron. As you can see from the slide again, the wildfire smoke particle measures 0.4 to 0.7 microns, just a little bit bigger than the coronavirus. But it's much more than pollen, that's around 15 microns and much less than sand. Fine particles pose a hazard to human health because any below 10 microns can be inhaled, and they enter deep into the lungs and may even into direct access to the bloodstream. And it can cause problems such as respiratory disease, an infection, cardiovascular disease, stroke, and premature death. For this reason, governments around and health authorities all around the world have what they call air quality index reporting, and levels that are basically something to aim for, to indicate what levels will be harmful to your health. And it's particularly important for people with health problems, such as asthma and other things. So basically, these are the ones for Canberra, the ACT, and it's based on the US AQI levels. And so it's the concentration of particulate, or not just particulates, but all air pollutants. And this is the one here for 2.5 PM 2.5, which is, as I said, the baseline for the fine particulates. Our building managers use these limits along with others such as carbon dioxide within the building to ensure that air quality is acceptable for human occupation. And they use widely available, relatively low-cost air quality monitors to measure it. And such monitors are helpful to conservators too. I'll show you our monitor later, but they read out the number of particles per cubic metre. I'll be referring to these numbers for health as well as for the collection during my talk, as we use this extensively as an objective guide to how bad it was. This number here is the air quality index is averaged over a day, but ultimately it's always expressed as the pollutant with the highest level for that period. And basically, quite often it is in Canberra, the PM 2.5. Okay, so the next slide. So I'll give you a second to read that quote, and I've summarised it a little bit, or shortened it from the original article with that by Grau, Beauvais and Strilich. And basically it's a bit of a tongue twister, but this quote sums it up well. Fine particulate matter is potentially the most harmful of all particle pollutants to cultural heritage, as it's detrimental to the aesthetic qualities and an agent of chemical degradation at the same time. The full quote actually in the article included important factors of their aerodynamic properties and typical composition, especially diesel, particulate matter, and carbonaceous particles. Because essentially, in terms of aerodynamics, they remain indefinably suspended pretty much until they stick to something. So they can travel a long way, be circulating, don't even realize it when you can't see it. The small size means that they're effective at penetrating, and the elemental and inorganic carbon combined with different elements provide for chemical interaction with materials. So there's a whole world of literature out there. Just thought you might like to see a few particles under the scanning electron microscope. There's some particulate literature out there, and it's mostly found in environment and atmosphere journals. As the reference I showed before, which is a literature review by Rao Bove and Strilich. It's a wonderful resource reviewing many of the published studies for the indoor cultural heritage field. I admit I haven't read all of them. Maybe David and Jean have, and have been authors in many, I'm sure. Throughout the literature review, I found the answer that I was seeking, that there's no standard description or characterization of soot. Actually, the concept of black carbon is used interchangeably. So despite some differences, though, they do have many common features. And you can see here with the images that on the left, it's a representation of a diesel particle, and showing the little blue and yellow spots indicating some elements attached. The middle one is a transmitting electron microscope, showing how the aggregates of the particles, and also C is candle soot. So it is similar, but a little bit different. There's more and more study now of bushfires in the literature, I've noticed, and that's partly for health reasons, bad climate change, and they can create their own weather patterns. So I thought some of these amazing images were very interesting to help our understanding, and you can see one of the differences is they have these tar balls connected with the carbon soot particles. I kind of like this summation as well of the relative sizes. The range of chemical pollutants is vast and basically beautifully documented in an article by Lee and others in 2003. And basically they've looked at individual aerosol particles from biomass burning. So on the left, at the top is a tar ball in scanning electron microscope. And then the one below it is tar balls attached to smoke particulates. On the right is scanning electron microscope of aggregates, and then, oops, the one below is also that with the tar balls attached. This one is a transmitting light electron microscope, and it's showing in the enlarged in the main photo, chemical inclusions, and you have there in this one ammonium sulfate particles. So it does show how they combine, and I found this quite helpful to understand it. And the relative size is pretty amazing too. And this one quickly shows aggregates of calcium sulfate and phosphate, and also potassium and magnesium. So I guess it's what's in the environment that accumulates and aggregates, mixes chemically. So, evidence of smoke damage in the literature is something that, we all know that soot is damaging, or smoke can be damaging to artworks. But when you look, I thought I'd do a bit of research to just double check myself before this presentation. And it is very interesting that there's not much written about the actual mechanisms and showing the damage, how it occurs. And thankfully, there is some now, but there's lots of evidence, manifestations, but actually how it happens hasn't been well documented. You can see here, here there's damage from smoke from a painting and also on stone. They're kind of the classic ones. And in outdoor sculptures from urban environments, and buildings, there's a lot of images and evidence. It's not basically the pathway has been hypothesized by authors. One, Camufo and others hypothesized there were 4 pathways that oxidized sulfur compounds, such as those in diesel particulates, can cause discoloration of paintings. Ammonium sulfate formed in the atmosphere can aggregate with carbonaceous particles and cause blooms, which is maybe what's happening there on paintings. Calcium sulfate present can increase soot adsorption, and also iron-rich particles can catalyze oxidation of sulfur dioxide and sulfuric acid. Diesel particulates also become hygroscopic and can favor the absorption of water that accelerates hydrolytic and oxidative processes, leading to fading of pigments and degradation of paper and textiles. So, thankfully, further research was done in 2016, and it was the same author of the literature review, Graal Wolver, along with David Thickett, and also many others. And they basically did tests to look at the degradation mechanism. So first of all, they collected samples on paper of particulates in the environment, both indoors and outdoors, at a range of sites. And this is a scanning electron microscope of particulate matter embedded in the paper fibers, so showing how it can get in. And basically they found there were deposits of transition metals such as iron, copper and chromium, and then they found that this contributed to a Fenton reaction, as was in the original hypothesis. They found that they did some aging of the samples and found that there was accelerated degradation of the cellulose. Also, thankfully, John has documented and collated in a study, or in all the studies and research out there, some limits for, like the Air Quality Index for human health, what there is as a guide for maintaining preservation of the collections. So in this one, which is an excerpt from one of his publications, it's saying that there's different action limits depending on the concentration. and so they're helpful for us. In reality, it's maybe not possible, but at the gallery, we consider that any smoke is something we need to deal with and try and prevent and remove if possible. Also, in terms of research, again, John has collated this and he would know more than I do about this, but in the literature, there are some, most of the research actually is about how much is present in an environment. And so here are some levels that were found around different buildings. So you can see that it does vary according to the place they are and the air quality and probably the resources the museum has, whether it's got air conditioning with filters or open windows and that type of thing. Okay, so getting back to Canberra now, after going a little bit international, we have pretty good air quality in Canberra in general because we don't have much outdoor pollution from diesel particulate matter, ozone, nitrogen dioxide or sulfur dioxide, because we don't have heavy manufacturing industries in Canberra. It's mostly public servants and politicians and people, normal people looking after them. So Canberra has also a low population density. The gallery is situated on the edge of a lake and it's close to the city centre, so right there. Canberra has the air quality monitoring every day, and you can look this up at any time. And as you can see, the one closest to the gallery is saying on a normal winter's day, it's good. Main thing that affects Canberra air quality is, as you can see, the PM 2.5, which is the highest number. And that is because in Canberra, people have a lot of wood-fired heaters. So in the suburban area where this one is taken from on the same day as the last slide, the air quality is fair. But in comparison to other cities, it's actually pretty good. The gallery also has excellent air conditioning system that filters air to hospital grade and basically goes down to, with a range of filters, down to below 0.1 microns. Also, our building is pressurized, maybe not perfectly, but it's designed to try and push most air out of the building. But every time somebody drills a hole in the wall or there's gaps, that does get less effective. We also, as I mentioned before, the air conditioning runs through a series of filters. So fresh air comes in, goes through the coarse filters or rock catchers, which get the larger particles above 10 microns. Then through another filter, it's around the same. And then the F8 filters get it's like a HEPA filter, you're probably familiar with, gets the particles out down to 0.3 to 1 micron. So that's not bad, but you can get finer. They're more or less efficient depending on the airflow, but the manufacturer state, it's around 95%. Then goes through to the galleries, and there's our conservator, David Wise, looking at a painting, and goes into the return air. Return air is recirculated, so we have 10% fresh air most of the time, for public building, and then the others are recirculated. So yeah, I would just mention that most of our gallery problem with particulates is from what is internally generated. And I know that you're all familiar with that, and the other speakers will talk more about this. I'd love to tell you all about how we've managed this risk from Urs Fischer's sculpture, Francesco, which is a burning candle. We did a lot of work to manage these risks from it, but that's for another talk. We also have the usual other construction problems, construction dust. We manage dust from people in the building, and some incidents. So yeah, until the bushfires, the worst bushfires ever. So in around September in 2019, bushfires started in Australia, and basically they were up in the north of Australia early on. It was one of the worst fire seasons ever, and although we were affected with the smoke, there were people a lot worse off than us. Estimates are that about 12.6 million hectares of land was burnt. In Australia, 5.4 million was in New South Wales alone, which is the closest big state to Australia, ACT. Well, we're surrounded by it. And 33 people died, an estimated billion animals died, and homes lost, many homes lost, and millions of people were concerned for their safety and that of others, as well as being affected by smoke. Also, they say from September 2019 to the end of February 2020, the Australian bushfires emitted 434 million tonnes of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So here's a little flick through of where the fires were spread out through Australia through the months. So September, they're up north mostly, October in the north, November moving down near Sydney, north coast, and then in December down to this Victoria, south coast, and in the Canberra region, in particular around December and January. And that's a brilliant image of smoke from fires in East Gippsland. So there's a lot. In December the 20th, the fires started to get closer to Canberra. And this is one at the Aurora Valley, which is south of Canberra. Canberra is basically surrounded by a lot of bush. You can see this great satellite image of the thick smoke blanketing the east coast of New South Wales, which, you know, did include Canberra region. So here I'm going to get into a few of these numbers for people's health and what's coming into our air conditioning. So basically, around that time, from the 29th to the 31st of December, the air quality levels began to deteriorate significantly, and they went from 150 to 200 micrograms per cubic metre. And that's very poor or unhealthy for everyone. In response, to this increased pollution, the gallery's aircon systems were adjusted to decrease the amount of outside air brought in, along with increased monitoring and of the smoke and readjustment or recalibration of the VESDA, which is the very early smoke detection apparatus. So it wasn't being set off all the time. Throughout the days the air conditioning technicians were doing whatever they could. However, in that time, the smoke was so concentrated that Canberra was ranked at the top of the polluted cities worldwide for 16 days during this time. So you can see that it's higher than places like India. And you might remember we talked about the hazardous scale. This graph from the publication sums it up well, that from the 1st to the 15th of January, the PM 2.5 concentration had been hazardous for 25 days out of 43. You can see that the huge increase on the 31st of December, and 1st of January, how extreme the smoke was. It was 25 times the hazardous level. The outside air quality PM 2.5 concentration on 8 p.m. on 31st of December, so New Year's Eve, when all disasters happened, it seems, on public holiday or something like that, Friday night, was then. Basically, the air conditioning, not the air conditioning, the smoke levels, particulate levels for 2.5 went from 150 to 600 micrograms per cubic metre. And in short, our VESTA alarms, smoke alarms, couldn't take it anymore and set off the smoke or fire alarms. So it thought we had a big fire in the building. Now, not even, basically what happened then was that they trigger the sensors and it opens up some relief valves. So it sets off, wants to suck the smoke out of the building, but just like in your bathroom, you have to have a bit of a relief, a little bit of air coming in so it can pull it out more efficiently. And some dampers open for that. And normally this isn't a problem, but because of the outside smoke was so high, it just pulled in more smoke. So it was a disaster that this happened as a false alarm. Now we can't turn that off either, it's illegal. So we have to wait till fire authorities come and do that. So we had large amounts of this smoke coming into the building unfiltered for about maybe 15 minutes. And you can see here, this image is our foyer of our gallery. Above there are the big smoke exhausts, but you could see the smoke quite heavy. So in the first instant this occurred, we did invoke our emergency response plan, which is both for protection of people and the works of art. Initially, it's the fire warden and security, building services, especially the air conditioning team, and conservation to coordinate and mitigate the risks with a range of practical measures. The business continuity team were also advised of the potential impacts for business the following business day. And we actually, business was critical because we had a blockbuster ticketed exhibition on in our temporary exhibitions wing at the time. So one of the first things that we did was conservators came in, but also the building services aircon technicians arrived. They basically cut all the air off after the VESTAs fire smoke alarm was turned off, but then we had zero outside air coming in and 100% recycling. So although there was smoke inside, we basically had that recirculating through the filters. So each time it went through, there was less and less, in theory, if it happened to go into the air conditioning duct. Basically, as I mentioned before, they do float around for a long time. In the meantime, conservators came in and looked at the works and noted that there was smoke present in all galleries, and some of it had settled on works of art. Not everywhere, but because the smoke was visible in the air, we knew it would deposit at some point. So to reduce the extent of the damage once it settled, measures were implemented to stop it falling on the art as much as we could. So the highest priority we had were unglazed works, and they were covered as much as we could with par silk or polyester covers, an open display. Other areas of the building, you can see where there was visible smoke. It was pretty much everywhere on that day. So some of the engineering and building controls that were very important to reduce more coming in were basically to close the front doors. The front doors have an airlock supposedly, but because they're automatic doors and people don't stop and wait for them to close, they're always open if it's busy. And so it was decided that the next day that they had to open the doors to the public, because it was New Year's Day and many tickets had been sold. And so the minimum we could do was shut the doors front, but we had an alternative entrance, which was upstairs, which had rotating doors, and these could also be, we're letting less smoke in. We also commenced our more monitoring on a more active basis for carbon dioxide and the particulates, because with the public present, we had to have some fresh air coming in, and we wanted to make sure that it was safe for people. We also had the air conditioning guys lower the flows of some areas and monitor the air conditioning. Here's a picture of the handheld monitors that we used to look at the smoke particulates. PM10 anything from PM10 you can inhale, and below PM 2.5 will be much more penetrating. So you can see this was maybe taken near a doorway. I'm not exactly sure where this one was taken from, but it's much higher than recommended for artwork or for health. And this is an example of the machine that we have just as a baseline, not during the fires. So this continued on, and the next day it was considered extreme, but the gallery opened because of what I mentioned before. Continued on like this for quite a while, that the outside air concentration was a little bit better, a little bit worse as the fires surrounded Canberra. And on the 4th of January, even though it was lower than 800, 300 micrograms per cubic meters, they were expecting many power surges, because at the same time we had 45 degrees Celsius air temperatures, and the building managers didn't believe they'd be able to maintain conditions for the comfort of humans and the artwork protection, humidification as well, and with these power surges, and keep ventilation to have the carbon dioxide levels safe for humans So there was a decision made to close the gallery, which had never been done before, except for Christmas and Good Friday. And it made worldwide news that the gallery had closed, but actually this gave opportunity for our air conditioning technicians to seal up the building because it was still coming in even through the rotating doors, and allow them to do maintenance of the air filters. So this photo here shows a picture of an unused filter, and this one here is 10 days worth, I repeat, 10 days worth of smoke accumulation over the 10 days prior. Here's a bank of these are the coarse filters, the F5s, a big bank of them, and these were basically had been renewed 10 days earlier, oops, sorry, and they were totally full within 10 days. Now, normally their service life is 2 to 4 years, so it's quite a lot. This is also an image of in our tunnels, which is where the air comes from, travel through and underneath the gallery, and you can see how much depositing there. So yeah, over the course of January, we had to keep the smoke continued because of the fires surrounding Canberra area, and we continued monitoring, and we just weren't able to close, and we did monitor what we could. Along the lines, every day we could cover works after the gallery closed. We did have some galleries closed for a period, but there came a point where we needed to open it due to the demand for the public. So here's a map of comparing when the doors were closed and when they were opened. So you can see the concentration of the particulates, PM2.5 particulates went up greatly once the doors were opened within 4 hours. But interestingly, they were mostly around 17 micrograms per cubic meter. So you'll see now in a moment, or you'll see from before that that's not as high as some, but it's still higher than we want, and we did act. So we also did a survey of all the artworks throughout the gallery and in January, and isolated samples from them. We also did what we could to remove them where possible while still on display by vacuuming, but we took samples with the cloth from the top of frames, plinths, and robust metal sculptures. And we looked at them under the microscope to confirm the level of smoke, but as we don't have SEM, we were just looking through transmitted light, but we detected the presence. We couldn't say how much, but definitely there. We also have an off-site store, which is in a semi-industrial area, light industrial, a semi-rural area, and there were some grass fires about 5 kilometres away. Here we found there was actual pieces of ash as well as just soot coming in, so clumps of it along because they come through air conditioning ducts. So this is on top of a rolled textile. So it does show the benefit of wrapping things with plastic. Most of the things in that works in those stores are actually covered. or in crates. And we had fires very close to the airport. So again, was off and on all months. The reason I'm, also around that time we did have a hailstorm. So it was the worst hailstorm ever in Canberra, and we had much damage to cars and the building itself. And so basically one reason I mentioned that is that we're able to get an insurance claim for the smoke damage as well as the hail damage. And this was beneficial to us in doing our treatments. So what did we do to treat the works? We basically devised a list with our disaster plan, and we cleaned frames post-exhibition. We also basically things we vacuumed with a HEPA filter vacuum, and we weren't wanting to push in the soot any further. And once things came off display, we did these treatments. There were some things that we couldn't treat without more equipment, and because of their condition, so works such as barks that had very brittle flakes and fragile media couldn't have anything done, so we were just going to have to monitor it, but most things were vacuumed. Another benefit of the insurance money was that we were able to buy some more. We were able to argue for glazing of paintings, and that was possible to do that. And these are going to be beneficial for touching as well, which is actually more of a risk to us, physical damage from touching, than smoke generally. There are more complicated treatments that can be done, and these can be found in the literature. This is an example from an Egyptian tomb of cleaning with gels that they did, but we didn't have that type of damage. And there are references I've got for that. Some of the other work that we were able to put up for in our insurance claim was to have the building pressurization investigated again and then recalibrated. And that will help a lot because soot particles can actually come in through cracks, and that's very small areas. So the pressurization will hopefully get updated, and we'll be able to push dust out, particles out. Also, we will improve our monitoring of this and that sort of thing. The other thing that I forgot to mention earlier is that part of what we want to do with our is get a better baseline for our ongoing dust monitoring. And we did find that we don't have a particularly good baseline to work off. So now that we have the more monitors, we're able to do this, and we're hoping that we can have a PM 2.5 dust particulate monitor put into our new air conditioning electronic system. So then we can have it given to us live updates of the internal air quality, not just the external. So without further ado, as I wrap up, I hope it's been interesting for you to hear about our damaging bushfire smoke and the steps we took to manage the risks while we went about business in a busy exhibition period. yeah, there are a few things we've learnt for next time, and we will be getting some improvements to our disaster training, and look at smoke, managing smoke in a more structured way. We'll also be getting some covers for
Thanks,
all the
Lisa.
works. Okay, so thanks
Sorry
very
to
much.
interrupt. It's
No,
so
that's all right, it's done.
fascinating. Sorry.
I just wanted to say that the references are going to be available in the version that you can look at online.
Yeah, they'll all be available on the website soon. Thank you so much. That's so interesting. I think we all felt so impacted by the bushfires. So it's lovely to see your side of it from in the gallery. We're going to quickly go now over to David. Sorry, we're going to be running a little bit over time, so I hope that's not a problem for anyone. But it was lovely to hear your talk, Lisa. Thank you. David, would you be ready to share your screen?
Sure. And I will, oh no, yeah. I would say I've never been a rock star before, so in the tradition, I will now try and warm you up for the headliner who's appearing later. So hopefully that's started. Today, I'm going to talk about a decision support model for pollutant measurement. And by pollutant in this talk, I am just talking about gases and vapors, not dust or particulates, effect assessment and mitigation. And the good news about this is a lot of the information I'm going to talk about, we've developed very significant online resources that you can look at, which means I can skip over some of the detail, and also you don't really need to listen to this, which is great. So we've developed this decision support model, which I'll explain what it is as we go along, but you can download the whole thing from a series of web pages on the Memori website, which is your top link, and we've updated it recently, which is on the English Heritage website. And there's also some spreadsheets to allow you to get the best out of this. So I deal with a lot of questions about pollution, and they quite frequently run along the lines of, we've observed corrosion on our bonzes, or we're worried about pollution in a set of showcases. What shall I measure? There's always this, what gases shall I measure? There's always a discussion at that point whether it's worthwhile measuring anything. If it is, usually a few weeks later, someone will come back with the concentrations are 1,000 micrograms per meter cubed of acetic acid, say 700 parts per billion. Are these safe? And then if they're not, what can we do about it? And you'll see the three questions or three topics that I'm going to talk about there. So this very long list is a list of gases that somebody has said has caused damage to cultural heritage objects. And I would say a lot of this is in the grey literature. It's not very well published, unfortunately. Most of these gases are gases that build up inside showcases. They do exist outdoors, but they're only exceptionally rarely at high enough concentrations to cause damage, with the exception of ozone and nitrogen dioxide that come from the gallery, and often from outdoors of the gallery. And in a typical showcase, you'll have between 1 and 300 gas species from a corpus of maybe 3 to 3,500. And that number is growing all the time as people put new construction materials into showcases. And recently, about 5 years ago, this really caught our profession by surprise with these piperidol compounds, the 6th and 7th on your list, where at the moment there were well over 3,500 showcases having to be refitted because of the emission of these gases that had been tested and not picked up with so-called emission tests. So there's a lot of gases there. And it's actually even worse because there are groups of compounds that we know are chemically very similar and should react the same way. Organic acids, such as acetic formic, but there's propanoic, butanoic, and a lot of higher ones. There were also species such as the peroxides, chlorides, and mercaptans that we know cause damage, but we don't know what the gas in the air is that's transporting that species to the object surface. Another way of looking at this is if you look at the literature, and as I said, this is not particularly easy to do. If you look at the reported number of damaged objects, and this is very difficult to get, most of the papers don't say how many objects were damaged. I've bugged lots of people, unfortunately, to get these numbers out of them. And the column on the left is what as good as I can get from the literature, but I would say this is very, very approximate. The column on the right are the numbers from my own studies, which is over 4,000 damaged objects, over 1,000 instances. So those numbers I'm much more confident about. But what you do see there is most of the damage is not being caused by that or being ascribed to or understood as coming from that many materials. Acetic and formic acid, hydrogen sulfide, then we're down into single figures, and most of the other gases, only a very small fraction of a percentage so far of reported damage. And this has been, I've recently written a paper going through all of this and the references below. So if we were just going to look at some gases, it's quite clear we'd worry about acetic and formic acid, and for the outdoor gases, nitrogen dioxide and ozone. I'd like to include this slide because I think it's important to realise we're working in a little bit of a vacuum of information here. If we had a measurement of acetic formic acid and the relative humidity for a particular material type, and this slide is for archaeological materials, it was published in a paper in 2012, would we be able to tell whether that material was at risk or not? And I've color coded it. So green means yes, we could tell. Yellow means we know a little bit, but we'd have to make some assumptions. And red means there really is no literature, no numbers to base this on. And as you can see, there's a lot of red and yellow on that slide for archaeology. And if we look at wider collection materials, it's actually probably even worse. So as we have some information, but there's a lot of knowledge gaps. There's a lot of work to be done in conservation research in the future if we're going to manage this well. So if you have an instance of deterioration, I would really strongly suggest that you beg or borrow some form of analysis because it can help you immensely if you do have this. And the top left silver, that's a sulfide. It's probably hydrogen sulfide in the air. The bottom right is lead formate. The bottom left is lead formate. The bottom right is sodium formate on glass. That's obviously formic acid that's causing that. The two other instances are quite complex mixed acetates, but in those instances, it's almost certainly acetic acid from the air. So that tells you what you need to monitor in those instances. Doesn't unfortunately always work that way. All of these compounds give a mixture of lead carbonates and oxides. Okay, so let's just talk about measurement, and there's a lot of information on those web resources I gave you. But if you were going to do some measurements, the top two columns of this are techniques you might be able to use yourself. So AD strips, I'll talk about a little later. Jean has published on the use of pH strips. Fuji make an indicator dot that will turn colour at 130 micrograms per meter cubed of acetic acid. If we're measuring at 1,000, that will just tell us that there's more than 130. It doesn't tell us whether there's 500 or 1,000 or indeed 3,000. If you are doing oddity tests or have a metal conservation, then just putting lead coupons out will work really well for acetic acid. And after about 12 days at 1,000 micrograms per meter cubed, you will be able to see white corrosion by eye. If you want to use some expensive analytical equipment, SIMS, secondary eye microscopy, mass spectrometry, then you can get an answer with that after a day, but it's not equipment that's widely available. And I put a cost, indicative cost in Australian dollars. Both of those are relatively cheap sets of techniques. If you want to get somebody else to do the analysis, the chances are they'll probably use diffusion tubes. And with these, you've got pictures on the right. They'll send you the tube, you take it out of its packaging, or you remove the top of it to expose it, leave it out usually for 14, 28 days, put it back in its packaging, send it back to whoever supplied it. They'll do the analysis. About a week later, you'll get a series of numbers. It will say there's 1,000 micrograms per meter cubed of acetic acid in this space and 300 micrograms per meter cubed of formic acid. Many of the health air quality people prefer active sampling. It's more expensive, and there are some drawbacks with this in showcases, and the paper I showed previously discusses some of the pitfalls of that. If you've got a lot of money, over $1,000, you can have some form of continuous monitoring, like our temperature humidity monitoring with this air core device. And the methods in red are techniques that aren't sensitive enough to pick up 1,000 micrograms per meter cubed of acetic acid. So it's Draeger tubes, copper coupons, and PortaSense is a little freestanding monitor, a little like the dust monitors we've just seen. Okay, so within a recent project, one of my colleagues, Stephen, developed AD strips in a kind of semi-quantitative manner. If you have a colorimeter, which several museums and galleries do have, you can put the AD strip out, measure it with the colorimeter, and it will give you a form of quantification. And here we see the graphs for the colorimetric coordinate, the B-star coordinate against the concentration of acetic acid. If you want to do this, drop me an email. I've got a spreadsheet that you can put your B-star in, the relative humidity. It will give you that acetic acid concentration or equivalent acetic acid concentration. One drawback of this is it will respond to formic acid as well, actually responds more strongly to formic acid, and you don't know which it is or what combination of the two gases it is that's giving you the response. What we've been working on, what I hope to publish in an AIC special edition early next year, is a visual chart to allow you to do this to an extent by the naked eye. And it should be that the color differences are big enough that you should be able to classify the equivalent acetic acid, if you put AD strips out, into these kind of levels. And you could also use this to calibrate up a scanner, which is often done in some industrial applications if you don't have access to a colorimeter, but hopefully coming soon. So I mentioned decision support model. What is this? And it's a way of taking you through the questions you're going to need to ask to be able to identify the risk, assess the measurements, and mitigate. And one important thing about this is this was done as part of a European Union project. It was part of the project's conditions that we had to write this for non-expert end users. So it's designed for people who've got less training, less education than conservators, something like a volunteer in a museum that's run by 2 volunteers, perhaps a manager, perhaps a curator. So there's a lot of background information that we felt we had to put in that, and also to try and guide people in a simple way through the decisions. It's available online at the memori.nilu.no site. There are web pages there. You can download the decision support model, which lives as a very large PowerPoint presentation. I'll talk about it in a little. And there's an updated version on English Heritage's website. Okay, so part of it, it takes you through these steps. Identify the risk. What materials have you got? What materials have you got? Object materials have you got? What materials have you got in your showcases? Is there likely to be a problem? It talks about measurement, but not ideally, and I'll explain why that is in a minute. Second, how to assess that measurement, which is not easy to do. And within this, we pulled together about 6,500 references that are spread all over the place to try and get this information together. And then it talks about mitigating the risk. Very importantly, you need to remeasure afterwards. And there are some case studies to take people through the process. It's got some hints about measurement. And for acetic acid, one of the issues is if you're in a naturally ventilated space, the levels are going to depend on the environmental conditions. This is a series of measurements of showcases in Malta. The blue bars are acetic acid on the left-hand column. And you can see if we measure in January, we get a level of about 160 micrograms per meter cubed. Looking at the Memori stuff, we know that is not actually a risk to anything. But if we did the same measurement in August, we'd have almost 1,800 micrograms per meter cubed, which is a risk to several types of material. So one of the tools that's in there is you can import either your monitored year's worth of temperature and humidity data or estimated data, and it will tell you what the relative fraction of acetic acid will be and what date would be the best date to actually make a measurement if you wanted the highest level. Okay. If you download the PowerPoint and you run it as a PowerPoint, all of the coloured spaces become active, and there's navigation tools within there like the arrow at the bottom. And this shows the materials that we've collated data for. If you click on any of them, it'll take you to a series of pages that I'll describe in a second. And it's not just from the literature. Within that project, we did about 30 person years research onto the effects of acetic and formic acid on paper, leather, parchment, pigments, and varnishes and textiles. And very little of that's actually appeared in the literature as yet. So the results only really reside within this tool. So if you click on one of those in the original decision support model PowerPoint, it'll give you a series of risks against your level of pollutant. And we've classified these as follows. Green, there's a very low risk of damage. Change is unlikely within 30 years. We said 30 years because we don't think we can go any further with the evidence we've got. It's probably longer than that. Red, there's a high risk of damage. You're probably going to need to do interventive conservation on the objects within 2 years, and you'll need to change the environment if you're not going to have to do that every 2 years. And it's important to realise that damage can occur much more quickly. I've seen lead corrode within 3 or 4 days of being put into a showcase, but we said 2 years because that's the kind of time frame that many institutions take to make decisions, and particularly if you need money or significant resources. Okay, so the original decision support model PowerPoint on the Memori website, you'll get charts like this. Within that project, we were developing these 2 ways of measuring, GSD that responds to acetic and formic acid, EWO that responds to nitrogen dioxide and ozone. They are commercially available, but they're quite expensive, and they're actually somewhat more expensive than using diffusion tubes at the moment. And then color coding for where the risk is. On the Memori web pages, there's this correlation chart that shows you what those levels are equivalent to in acetic acid or formic acid or nitrogen dioxide or ozone. And in the updated version on the English Heritage website, we've got both sets of numbers there. The other changes we've made is we've added another 5 or 6 materials to the list, and the Memori work was all done at 50% because that RH, because that's the all the time that we really had. But on this one, for the metals that are very strongly affected by humidity as well, there's a 30 and 75% as well. And top right, there's some information about the impact of hydrogen sulfide, the next most commonly damaging pollutant down that list. And the buttons at the bottom take you to more information about these materials. So if we look at the observed damage on copper alloys, and this is so non-experts could recognize damage when it was occurring. We talk a little bit about what does it look like. I don't expect you to read this, what the compounds are, and how you identify them with X-ray diffraction, FTIR, or Raman, if you can get access to such. A little bit about the technical stuff, you know, what levels have been seen to cause damage at what relative humidities, and there's also links to the actual literature where these numbers came from, and something about other factors that might affect the deterioration. Okay, so you've done your measurement, you've assessed there's an issue with damage, what are you going to do about it? And there are several different things that you can do. And as with much of preventive conservation, the devil is in the detail. And that's what we really developed this model to try and walk you through what your alternatives are, how likely they are to be successful, what the costs are likely to be economically in both the initial and long term. And within the website, we talk about different ways of stopping the problem. You can reduce pollutant concentration, reduce relative humidity, which can be cheaper. And also we have a lot of monitoring anyway, unlike pollutions. You can reduce oxygen concentration, but it's quite expensive. I'm just going to talk about reducing pollutant concentration here. And we've taken this scheme or modified it from Jean's excellent book from 2003. It's hierarchical. The best thing to do is to avoid the problem in the first place. Only use materials that have been tested, ideally with the ODI test. You can block it, try and put something on the surface to stop the gases getting out, but there's a chance it will fail. And as you go down the hierarchy, there's a less chance of initial success and a greater chance of failure. And I'll explain what I mean by that with a couple of examples in a minute. We can dilute the air either by putting holes in the showcase or adding a fan, and we can use some form of absorbent such as activated charcoal. So this is my colleague Paul putting a aluminium film onto a ropey 1970s blockboard that we know was causing corrosion. And they're quite robust, those films, but if you mistreat them, you can damage them. And there are a couple of breaks in the film here that will let the gases out. People often ask about liquid sealant, so something you can just brush onto an MDF or a piece of wood and stop it off gassing. We really do need some more work on this. I did some work on it a very long time ago. And two things to bear in mind at the time. One, of the 28 materials I selected from what people were recommending for this, 22 of them were actually far worse than the MDF itself. So they were more corrosive towards lead than having just the MDF there. We found a couple of materials that were good for short-term use, but nothing for longer-term use. And unfortunately, the ones that we found that were good are no longer available. As I said, this is a piece of research that would be very welcome. Okay, and even if you did have an absolutely perfect sealant that you could paint on, it's still reliant on how well people put things together. This is a silica gel facility made out of MDF, and you can see as somebody's put a screw through here, they cracked the MDF, and even if the sealant was covering all of that surface, that crack would let a lot of gas out. Okay. We have several tools within there. They're usually Excel spreadsheets. This is one for ventilation, so it's increasing the air exchange rate or ventilation in a showcase. And if we do a measurement, say the Red Cross, say we've got 800 micrograms per meter cubed of acetic acid, and we've measured the air exchange rate at 0.3. That puts the cross there. If we want to put lead in that showcase, we know from the Memori stuff we need to keep below 400 micrograms per meter cubed. Then we'd need to increase the air exchange rate of the showcase to 2.2 or so to achieve that. It's a logarithmic graph. It's not easy to read. So the top right number areas in green, you can put the current and new air exchange rate in and it'll feed the numbers out to you. And for this spreadsheet, you only really need to add 3 bits of information, which are the top left. The first is the volume of the enclosure, which is quite easy to work out. The second is the surface area of emissive material, and you need to know which of your materials are emissive, and there's lots of information on the PowerPoint on the web sites to tell you that. And then the third is this number called the deposition velocity in yellow, and the next page of the spreadsheet has a collation of all of those there. Okay, I'll talk about absorbents such as charcoal cloth, and you often get these 3 questions when you're using them. How much do I need to put in? Where do I put it in? How often will I need to change it? Because that is a bit of a pain and you need to be able to monitor to do that. And there have been some reports of re-emission. And again, the reference below gives a paper that talked all about these factors. This is the King's Library at the British Museum, 18th century, sorry, wooden book presses reused for display. They're listed, we couldn't change them. So as we looked at what the acetic acid levels were, and we looked at putting activated charcoal cloth on the bases of these. Variety of objects that are sensitive: shell, copper alloys, some of the pigments on those prints, and also there was some lead. And this is the result with covering the whole of the shelf, a half of it, a quarter of it, a sixth of it, and how much reduction. We had about 700 micrograms per meter cubed of acetic acid in there. So to get down to 400, we needed a 50% reduction, which is a quarter of the shelf being filled with activated charcoal. And in the end, it was used as granules in these kind of frames that are actually really well hidden within the showcase. Second example, this is a schematic of wooden drawers used for storing lead, Greek and Roman shot, which was having to be conserved every couple of years because it was corroding. About 2,500 micrograms per meter cubed of acetic acid in there. Again, we looked at using activated charcoal cloth just on the base because it was easy, the base and sides because it was easy, and if we had to cover the sides and the underneath of the drawer above, which was actually very difficult to do practically, but as it turns out, that's what we had to do for displaying lead in there because we know the acetic acid concentration needs to be below 400 micrograms per meter cubed. Something that many of the manufacturers, particularly of charcoal cloth, will do for you is a remaining capacity test. You just need really a 4-figure balance. It is something we've done. You calibrate the cloth up, put it above industrial, it's usually 1% weight volume methyl acetate. We've used acetic acid, and look at the capacity, and from those drawers with 2,500 micrograms per meter cubed of acetic acid, a very high level. After 5 years, we still had over 85% of the remaining capacity. And we continued doing these measurements, and our conclusion was in that situation, we needed to change the charcoal cloth after about every 15 years, which was quite a good thing because it was quite tricky to replace it in that instance. There were 2 reported instances of re-emission. And the worry is that if you put this stuff into something with a high concentration or reasonably high concentration, it'll pick it up and something will change and make it off gas a lot more than it's picked up over a long time. We looked at it passively, which is how we normally use it, using these quite heavily concentrated cloth from very heavy, high concentrations, and we really found we could only ever get it to off-gas about 100 micrograms per meter cubed, even at high temperatures, changing the humidity. So that's probably safe for most things. But if you do put it in a pump and the air changes dramatically, you can kick out relatively high levels, but still a lot lower than what we had originally there. Okay. The final thing I'm going to share with you today is the final tool that we developed. And what this does, it's an Excel spreadsheet. It's a list of 15 questions with drop-down answers. And here we see some of them. What's the air exchange rate of your showcase? Are staff based at the site? Are all emissive surfaces available, accessible? Is control of humidity important? Because things like putting a pump fan in, or putting a filter in a pump will reduce the RH control in the showcase, and they'll also probably bring in more dust. So as you answer these questions, and from your answers, it will then provide this overview of the different methods you can use to reduce pollution. Is it possible? How likely is it to be successful? What's the initial cost going to be, and what's the ongoing cost going to be annually? And we're hoping to develop this further fairly soon to include things like carbon footprint as part of that. And we've got all of the data for that. So that's what I'm going to talk about. As I said, there's a lot more information available online. It's a quick summary. I encourage you to look at the websites if you're interested in this, and the tools have been designed to guide you to the bits that you're interested in, because it is a very big topic. And I should just finish with acknowledging the very many partners within the Memori project that was generously funded by the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. That was fascinating. And I'm just now going to share my screen, and Jean's speech will come up. Just one moment.
Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. Good evening.
Is my screen sharing?
Yes.
Pollutant control guidelines, past and present. So it is a very short survey or review of
The sound has been cut.
Oh. Sorry, I'll just try that again. Is it working? No?
No sound yet.
I clicked the button for sharing sound.
of the proposed guideline passed up to now. More the beginning and the end than the middle. Well, anyway, so we'll do my best, and you will see that sometime I'll make some link between the speed limit in the road. So in terms of outline, it will be really a focus on the impact of pollutant inside the museum to the artifact inside the museum, not what really happened outside of the museum. We'll do, as I say, very short history of pollutant guidelines, and we'll spend a few time. This is probably a hard time for many, that how the quantification of damage can eventually help us to draw better guideline. And I will finally talk about one of the latest proposal of guideline for pollutant control. So we had to travel to time to the past, and the major step about guideline on pollution is the famous Gary Thompson in UK with his book The Museum Environment. It was published in 1978, and Thompson at that time, he was not the first one, but he was known already from the 1930s that had been quantified the impact of the pollution on the books and papers. And it was clear at that time that bookstore in the polluted area, industrial area, were much more damaged than bookstore in the countryside clean area. So basically, Thompson decided to pick up the typical concentration on the countryside and become the first guideline. It was achievable for most HVAC system, ventilation system, without specific gas filters. So he come with some number with his book. The unit of maximum concentration allowed are in microgram cubic meters. So for nitrogen dioxide, he said the limit should be 10, 2 for ozone, and 10 for sulfur dioxide. What we have to remember is those numbers are from the observation on paper, but have been applied to the general collection. So this is the picture of the second edition. Was somehow known as the Bible in conservation, and you could see that Thompson has very mythic position, that somehow he has a good connection with the Bible issue, if I could say. What's happened in USA? How the first guidelines started? Well, in the American way, it started with a kind of a scandal. So Jack Anderson in 1979 wrote a paper about how the American archive was well protected or lack of protection. Jack Anderson was a very well-known journalist, investigator, liked to search to try to see what the government is doing officially or non-officially, and he liked to do some digging in the archives. And then suddenly on his paper, he realized that the collection was under gradual destruction, fire, a lot of missing items, and also with incorrect support. Of course, the National Archive reply, and they say, well, it is greatly exaggerated, but somehow the door was open. So the Congress really want to hear what the National Archive has to say. But at the end, they conclude that they need to develop standards, and they develop many committees. They have created many committees on different aspects of the archive fields, and they have a meeting about indoor air quality that was run in 1983. They have 25 participants, were like archivists, scientists, and HVAC engineer, ventilation engineers. So the first step, they have to agree about what should be the air quality criteria. So it should be acceptable, measurable, not with a wet chemistry, but something is approved direct reading instrument, achievable and sustainable. But then they also realized that there were little conversation on the fact of on the issue of interaction between the pollutant and the archival material. How bad are the pollutant? Which level do we have? Which level is dangerous? So they conclude a little bit by in absence of quantitative dose response relationship. The trend is, well, for those for the gas that we know with some limited detection, we rely to the limit of detection, and for the others, we'll kind of recommend use the best available technology. Now you can really see that there were a push from the HVAC engineer or the HVAC industry. That means that on my table, we could see the document from the National Bureau of Standard in '83. That document was for the National Archive. They come with the number maximum pollution level similar to Thompson, but they add new pollutant like acetic acid, formaldehyde, hydrogen chloride. But then by lack of knowledge or lack of data, they say use best control technology. Now, the term of use best control technology that become a trend. Either people use low limit of detection and how when the museum proposed lower limit, then other institutions try to always match with the lowers that people propose. So at the end, it was kind of a direction of somehow, if you drive, it would have say like a slow, drive as slow as possible. Even at one point, people will say, well, we should ask for zero pollutant. It's like, please do not drive. Does it make sense? Probably not, because how much it costs to have very small amount of pollution in the building, and you have to remember that museum has other challenge that humidity, have a fire, water damage, security, and everything. So there were a need of, instead of asking for the lowest and lower limit of detection, which tend to go lower and lower, maybe was a point that we need to know, well, when bad is bad and which condition we really have problem, we should minimize that. So in 2003, I tried to compile, to collect what was the information known about interaction between pollutants and material, compiled that in a book. And basically, I came with an approach which was from the risk assessment field, which was based on two approaches. We'll see that. So the first one, before it was based on the observed adverse effect, or when we'll see a critical damage, a small change of color, small change of pH, a small change of the physical resistance. So when we'll get a small damage or critical damage. Now, when we select a key or specific damage, now how long it will take to reach that damage based on concentration and time. And come with the dose aspect. So we're going to be looking for the lowest observed adverse effect dose, which has the notion of reciprocity. It's a bit with a camera with the light and time. So the dose is like if dose to cause a small damage is 10 ppb year, ppb is also a concentration. Either you reach that dose with 10 ppb for 1 year for a specific gas and material, or you may take 10 years with 1 ppb. It's all the same dose. So how will we will determine the load from a specific material and pollutant? Here, my example, we have a pigment, unknown pigment for you today, and it was exposed to 100 ppb of sulfur dioxide. So to measure the change, we rely on the change of color, and one way to quantify the change of color is by using the unit delta E, which is a change of color. And the critical or the lowest observed adverse effect was defined as a delta E equal to. It means that many conservators will agree that when the color change is 2 or more, it becomes significant. So the point is how long it will take to reach that change of delta E up to 2. In our graph, it takes 0.5 weeks. So the dose become 100 ppb of sulfur dioxide multiplied by the time, 0.5 weeks. Then we modify it to years. and we get a dose close to 1 ppb year. The other tool that we have to assess the sensitivity of material to specific pollutant is the approach of the NOEL, which is the non-observed adverse effect level. It is the level that after a long time you don't see a damage. So somehow concentration at that level and below is kind of safe for a long period of time. For example, we have exposed lead or untarnished lead exposed to acetic acid for a different concentration for a different period, 1 to 12 months. And we realized that at 0.4 milligram, or if you want 400 microgram cubic meter, nothing happened even after a year. So this will be our NOEL. That's mean that as long as you keep your silver below 400 microgram cubic meter of acetic acid, you should not see a damage. Of course, your lead can be exposed to high moisture, CO2, other gases, but now that system just see one material, one gases. So I've done a compilation and make a generalized to a general collection, if I could say. So the approach of that table, still in microgram cubic meters, is how long a museum will accept one step of fading or small damage. Do they want to have a small change, small damage every 1 year, or every 10 years, or every 100 years? So this is the target for general collection. And because for general collection, some high-risk pollutant material interaction, such as lead and acetic acid, or silver and hydrogen sulfide, are excluded. So for example, if you don't want to see any damage for 10 years, this is the maximum concentration you should be allowed. If you be 100, all the concentration is divided by 10. This approach has very moderate success. One of the reasons is nobody was really sure which target to choose. And from what I hear, many people try to target the 10 years, but it was just a small amount of museum. There were few other standards proposed. So after CCI in 2003, some start to also relax and also use the approach of real knowledge of interaction between pollutant and materials. So a British standard was released in 2012, which proposed somehow a bit higher number. And of course, stay away from use the best control technology. Between Thomson and the end, there were much more standard have been reviewed, and those review can be found in a paper published in 2018. It was called the evolution or specification for limiting pollution in the museum, and I will give you the reference at the end of the presentation. Now, of course, controlling a pollutant or guideline for pollutant is difficult because it's very easy to control, to measure temperature. You need to pay a bit more money for relative humidity, and you have to buy your light meter somehow to a specialized place. But pollution is expensive. If you have low sensitivity, yes, it will be low cost, but if you want to have high sensitivity, well, the cost can go very high. And we fell on the trap. That means by recommending a lot of number, but somehow most of medium and of course many or most of the small size museum cannot afford to pay for investigate the pollution, because it's pollution usually it's from one gases, and if you want to analyze many gases, the price go up very quickly. So we have to find a new approach that some people can make step or be confident about what they can do. Here we come with the latest proposal. It was from ASHRAE. ASHRAE is an American association for the HVAC engineer, but it's also well known around the world. And since 1999, they have already a chapter for everything about ventilation for museum, galleries, and archives. And in 2019, they have the latest edition, which was a fully revised document. And David Tickett was also on that committee. And the pollutant section come with a new approach that we'll see very soon. And you could either get that table that we see soon from the ASHRAE Association website, or you could download it for free. You could get it for free from the latest CCI technical bulletin on pollutants. So basically come with three levels of control: the basic, intermediate, advanced. So basically the basic, you have basic fine particle, and you avoid the most common problem in enclosure. That's good because you avoid most of the common problem. Intermediate, you may want to improve the particle control, but the goal here is mainly to reduce the risk assessment by doing some spot tests, but also help you to reduce the uncertainties of your approach. The advanced level, well, you have all the money to do a full risk assessment and to do expensive monitoring, so there's no limit at the advanced level. Let's see it on more detail. So at the basic, yes, at the building level, display case, consideration. At the basic level, you have particle filters recommended by Office Space or the LEED program certification, which is like they may recommend the MERV 13 as a specific type of filters efficiency. Inside the cases, the material that you use have to be recommended by the conservation professional. And you identify the object that tend to be at high risk from pollutant. So it would be lead, silver, some glasses, cellulose. At the intermediate level, you may need to improve the efficiency of the particle filtration depending on how is polluted your outside of your building. And then you may consider some spot tests to make sure that the choice of material is the right one. In terms of consideration, you may want to avoid high humidity and high temperature. At the advanced level, as I say, well, the sky is the limit, so you could use with higher particle filter efficiency. You may even consider gas filter if it's needed. You may also consider if your cases should be very airtight or leaky based on the risk assessment, and do the airtight measurement to know what you have and what you want to have in terms of airtightness. And the maximum, if you really want to go to number, here my list of number, which is equal to the 1 year that we have seen with my summarized table from the book 2003. To conclude, you can see that this new approach allowed people to make action without going through expensive monitoring. So already small museum, medium-sized museum most museum can afford easily the basic approach. And then some intermediate museum may want to do a step further by doing some spot tests and getting more confident on their approach. And of course, a big museum with a lot of resource can go deeper on their risk assessment. So as promised, I show you the reference of what had been mentioned on that publication, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jean. I'd now like to introduce Rosemary Goodall to moderate the question and answer session between all our speakers tonight. Thank you, Rosemary.
Thanks, Rhiannon. Hi, everybody. Lisa, are you there going to join us as well? Thanks. We've got a couple of questions here from the audience. One that's seems very popular is really addressed to you, David, I think, and they want to know how many of the different types of gases known to cause damage to objects are known to derive from degradation of synthetic materials, for example, rubbers and plastics that are used in the manufacture of display cases.
Yeah, good question. A lot of those on there, but there are probably half come from what we call naturally sourced materials. So, you know, wood was the classic thing for acetic and formic acid. There's a group of 10 gases that are given off as paper boards degrade, most of which can corrode lead and will accelerate the corrosion of paper. But I'd say, over half of them are purely gases from synthetic materials, and there's maybe another, almost all of them can come from synthetic materials as well, which is why testing the materials is so critical, because it is far cheaper and easier to avoid this problem than to try and fix it when it's happened.
Yes, I would think it is. I've got another question here for you, David. Is it possible to purchase the Memori kit and measurement device? And if yes, where?
Where? Yeah, right. Okay. Memori hit a bit of an unfortunate dead end. So it's the idea of you can buy the dosimeters separately. So it's the GSD one for the acetic and formic acid from the Fraunhofer Institute, but it's about $400 US, I think. They send it to you, you send it back to them, they send you the number. And similarly, the EWO one from NELU, which is the same website that I gave on the list, that's about $40 US, but you can buy diffusion tubes for ozone and nitrogen dioxide for about $30 Australian. And I'd say you're probably better off buying them. The idea with Memori was to develop a reader, if anybody's seen this, so you could maybe buy that for, we were hoping for a few $100 Australian. It may have been a bit more expensive, but it would allow you to then get the dosimeters much cheaper, because it's the laboratory analysis at the end that's the expensive bit. And we were hoping we could really drive down the cost, particularly of acetic acid and formic acid measurement. But that, although we developed it in the project, the Fraunhofer then pulled out and said they weren't interested in further developing the glass slide dosimeter. So sorry, that's a complex answer, but you have, that's where we are at the moment, which is why having the other measurement methods is so important. If you get anything that measures acetic and formic acid, you could use all the Memori information with those correlation charts. And AD strips are very cheap, and if you've got a colorimeter, relatively accessible.
That was going to be my question to you, actually. For institutions that don't have a lot of money, is the AD strip a useful option for them?
Yeah, I mean, if you've got a colorimeter, they're a couple of Australian dollars each. So you can do as many measurements as you want. Hopefully next year with the correlation chart, which you'll notice the numbers correlate to the levels in Memori, you could, even with eye, you can get some idea that's probably quite useful. But it won't detect the very fine levels of acetic acid.
Right.
By eye.
Thanks, David.
Can I add something?
Yes, please do, Jim.
Based on the question about the impact of the material used inside cases, I wrote something on the chat, but I realized I just replied to the panelists and not to everyone. So what I wrote is like at TCI, when I test a gasket, like a rubber gasket, not silicone, but everything like a dark color gasket. And when I test them, half or third of them contain a sulfur that could eventually tarnish silver. And the same ratio, about the third of the paint tested that could be applied to paint inside the cases also contains sulfur. So on these days, there have been a shift of the issue of the presence of sulfur in material. I mean, even Sintra is kind of a rigid PVC foam. It used to be safe, you used to pass the OD test, or maybe not, but actually was safer. And now it contains sulfur that can tarnish silver very quickly. So somehow we resolve some problem, but we will also get new problem.
Definitely. Lisa, I've got a couple of questions here for you. The first one was with the images of the particulates you showed at the beginning of your presentation, I think. Are these particles that you've found attached to filters?
They weren't my images, actually. I've quoted the references. I found those in the presentation. So you could go back and look at those. I believe they were taken from aerosol samples. So these were done in air quality research papers. So
possibly on filters, but within sampling equipment rather than anything else.
And a lot of them were on, filter papers.
Yeah.
So we only have transmitting light and polarizing light microscopes at the gallery.
Yeah.
So we still could detect that they were, but not to that extent.
Yeah. And I've got a second question here. Did the HVAC system trial using lower particle HEPA filters, was it less than 0.3 microns?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I forgot to mention that one of the other advantages of having the incident is that often management does react to disasters more than me or the air conditioning guys asking for improvements to prevent things, unfortunately. So yeah, they were able to get what's called the F9 filter, which isn't quite at the level of a HEPA filter, but it does filter down to 0.1 micron. So that will catch the smoke, fine particulates. You can get HEPA filters, but I'm not sure why they didn't get those. It could be to do with the amount of airflow and the pressure able to be in our system. So yeah, F9 works fine. So that's good. Another thing.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. I've got a question here about museum storage that I'm not sure who this one's targeted at, so please jump in if you have an answer. Should small museums adjust storage to be housed like materials together to reduce interactions? I think what they're trying to ask is, should you be storing, plastics with plastics or wood with wood to try and reduce interactions from one to the other?
I was just going to say that there is certainly a risk, and there's quite a few documented instances of plastics and a variety of other things starting to affect other materials in storage. And there's also a push, certainly across Europe, to use much lower air exchange rate storage for sustainability, which increases all the gas problems. So it's certainly not a bad idea. And there certainly are risks. The other things with housing like with like is it can improve quite dramatically your sustainability, because you can keep all of your objects that need tight RH control together and not have to condition the whole store for perhaps a small portion of your collection. But there is definitely a risk there, and it's worth considering.
Sorry, Jean, I've got a question for you here. It's from Helen, and she says, I was interested to hear David say many coatings used to seal MDF are often worse than the MDF. Jean, do you still recommend 4 weeks of off-gassing for low VOC water-based paint for coating MDF in display cases?
That's a good news. Somebody remember that 4 weeks, which is very a painful recommendation, because let's be honest, nobody has 4 weeks to let dry their paint. I don't know many museums allowed to do that. Sometimes the good museum or museum have the time as a luxury. They could wait 2 weeks. Many will be 1 week, many will be 1 day, and many are not aware of that. In terms of VOC, unfortunately, they were not, seen my paper from the 90s, there were not much paper on systematically research about off-gassing and everything. What I've seen from Alexandria, anyway, it seemed that there's still no relationship between low VOC and safer. We still have the issue of acetic acid. Even some paint that inside the paint formulation do not contain acetic acid, but when you apply, when it dry, there's some chemical reaction and acetic acid is released. So up to now, low VOC or zero VOC, it's not a proof of completely safe, unfortunately. If we have data that confirm to say, will be very welcome. Up to now, mainly by lack of data and some localized information that the risks seem to be the same.
I've got another question for you, Jean. Lisa asks, has there been any further research on Tyvek off-gassing?
I'm not aware of extra research or not published research. Maybe David could add something. I just see the last Christmas last year, there were a lot of conversation in the conservation distribution list, and the people report damage, and some come with some explanation. Sometimes was caused by simply microclimate. It was not the Tyvek itself, but it was the environment generated by the seal environment. Maybe Tyvek made of polyethylene can cause something. Still unclear of what was the real problem or the source. And yeah, maybe David, do you have seen something about that?
Well, not specifically with Tyvek, but one thing that's become quite clear is polyethylene, which is, you know, what Tyvek is quite absorbent to gases. And certainly some of the polyethylene foams, there's now some quite well documented, you know, the foam went in having passed an ODI test. 4 weeks later, it was emitting, or not 4 weeks, a couple of years later, it was emitting acetic acid, which we think is absorption, not degradation. So you'd imagine Tyvek could do the same thing, but I'm not aware of any actual quantitative tests as yet.
But when the polyethylene degrades, it also release something. And one of my interests one day is to see from the market if we could know which polyethylene film will be stable than others. It's like with the same thing with polyethylene foam. Some seem to be more stable than others. It would be nice to know from which process composition that can help us to select which polyethylene film or foam can be better than others.
And we've got some work looking at that for the polyethylene bags that we store objects in. But the other problem we're getting with those is there's so much recycling now that usually when you buy a polyethylene bag, a large portion of it's been recycled, sometimes several times, which does affect the stability.
I think we've got a couple more questions coming up, but I think we're running out of time now. We have gone quite a long way over. So we might call it a night there. And just to let everybody know that any questions that haven't been answered, we will try and answer them and put that up on the website after the presentation. So I'll hand it back to Rhiannon.
Thank you, Rosemary. Thank you to everyone for attending a wonderful night of discussions with our very generous speakers. We especially thank our international rock stars for accommodating our time zone here, and Lisa for being a fabulous support act, and Rosemary for moderating. We had so many questions. Nights like tonight are made possible by the generosity and wisdom of invested professionals such as you all. Thank you all for being patient with our timing. It's very clear that this is a subject that we could all talk for days about. So it's we hope to plan more webinars on this exact topic in the future. Tonight's forum was a free event made possible by the ongoing support of our very generous sponsors and the AICCM, who are working hard behind the scenes to make this series possible and accessible to all. We're so grateful to the support of the AICCM. There's a lot of work that goes on to make these webinars, keeping them online available as resources for the future. So thank you. I hope you all enjoyed tonight and that we see you at next month's forum for our 7th Agents of Change. I'm just going to share. Just one moment. So the next one for our 7th agent is theft, vandals and repatriation. This is going to be a really interesting panel discussion featuring, oops, sorry. Can you see that now? Featuring Dr. Lyndon Ormond Parker, Danny Williams and Dr. Amber Aranui. Dr. Robin Sloggett will be moderating the discussion and we're expecting it to be a really thought-provoking session. Registrations are already open for this. It's on in just over 2 weeks on the 16th of September. So please register now for that and we'll look forward to welcoming you all back very soon. Thank you all and good night.